And good evening, folks, and welcome to Bison Chat, Tuesday, November 26th. I'm Galen Clavio. That's Joe Cronin over there. We got Emily Fox behind the scenes, pushing the buttons, making the magic happen. We are here to talk about IU football. We're here to talk about the college football playoff. A lot to talk about as Indiana coming off their first loss of the season, a disappointing one as they lose at Ohio State. But a lot to look forward to this week as we see the updated CFP rankings. We got the bucket game this weekend. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Joe, you've been all over the place here lately. You were, I think, up in Green Bay this weekend. So good to have you back. How you doing?
I'm good. It's been a lot of travel. I'm heading out tomorrow to travel for family, but Columbus, Green Bay, and then back to Ohio for family matters. So it's been good. It's a busy time. I guess no time to rest. Just go, go, go.
This is how this type of year goes, and especially when you have a good football team. This is not something we're used to as far as Indiana and this time of year. But nice to have that problem as the Hoosiers 10-1 on the season, and they suffer their first loss, as I mentioned, as they fall to Ohio State by the score of 38-15. This was one of those games that, unfortunately, a bunch of things went wrong for Indiana against an opponent that you really couldn't afford to have anything go wrong against. And, ultimately, Joe, you got to see it, same as I did. You were on the sidelines. I think I was up in the stands. But regardless of what your vantage point was, it was just not the game Indiana would have liked to have played, a lot to look back on and just kind of shake your head at and say, gosh, if this had gone different or that had gone different, maybe it's a different game. But Ohio State also kind of clearly demonstrated that, at least at this point, that's the superior outfit.
Yeah, they did flex their muscles a little bit in that one. Obviously, you can look at some of those special teams moments and be like, it could have been a closer game. But really, outside of the opening drive that Indiana had, and sure, their last drive, they went down and scored, Ohio State had their number. And it was the big presence was on their defensive line, their blitz packages they sent. I mean, Curtis Rourke was on his butt 5 times. He was getting drilled, got strip sacked on one of them. It was tough. The offensive line looked confused. They had to go to a silent count. That was something that Cignetti talked about both in his post-game press conference and then yesterday in his weekly availability. And it was tough. That was something I was really watching for, is when Rourke, he would point, and it was the right guard would be looking back at him, and he would signal to Mike Kadick when to snap it. And I think it was solid, but there were a few moments where they got a delay of game. And I think that, when you're having to look at the center rather than forward, it just messes some of the timing up a little bit. And you could notice that they were smart about their blitzes. And then, offensively, they just couldn't move the ball. You go back to those 2 special teams plays, though. It's like that 5-minute stretch, 90 seconds left or however many time there was with James Evan dropping the snap and then the Caleb Downs punt return touchdown. It could be, I wouldn't say a different game entirely, but you see that nationally, you would have seen a lot closer of a game, I think.
Yeah, it was one of those games where I think if Ohio State's going at full strength, the full 40 or full 60 minutes, it's probably still an Ohio State victory, even if Indiana doesn't make the mistakes. We talked about this a little bit on this show, but we talked about it a lot more on the other shows. Like, the one concern that you had from Indiana was, were they going to be able to handle the environment? And the silent count was really as big of an indicator as anything of the problems with the environment. It's one of those things where if you're playing in Memorial Stadium, you're not having to deal with that level of noise. So you're able to use snap counts to your advantage. That didn't happen here. And Indiana just looked like a sitting duck most of the time. Curtis Rourke just under constant pressure really from the second quarter on. And, there's some things you could go back and look at and maybe second guess in terms of the game plan. Do you try to focus on the run more? Do you have a short pass package? But Ohio State brought something to bear that they hadn't brought to bear in the other games that they played this year, which was a really aggressive blitzing package that didn't just rely on their front 4. And look, Indiana wasn't ready for that, and they ended up kind of paying the price for it. But all that said, as I think a lot of people have pointed out, Indiana didn't play as bad as I think many people have tried to argue that they played. The running game was actually really solid. It looked like they didn't have a lot of running yards, but that was because they lost so many running or rushing yard numbers due to the Rourke sacks and due to that James Evans dropped punt, which when he fell on it, that counted as like a 23-yard loss. But Tyson Lawton rushed for over 5 yards a carry. Justice Ellison rushed for close to 4 yards a carry. They would have had a pretty good running game, I think, if they'd been able to stick with it and they hadn't fallen so far behind. And then, you look at the defense. If you are being charitable and don't want to assign that very last touchdown to the defense, then the defense really only allowed 17 points to be scored by Ohio State. So, a lot of those things added up to where you could take some positives from IU. And Curt Cignetti was asked about this in his media availability on Monday and kind of pointed out that it wasn't extraordinary issues that Indiana had, but it was really more ordinary issues that led to the loss.
Yeah, offensively, they just really couldn't move the ball once they got that momentum stripped away from them. I think that was one of the more glaring issues. Defensively, they played all right. I think something that I noticed, it was outside of the Travion Henderson, that 39-yard run when he sat on the 1 at the end of the game, they would have held them to under 300 yards. Yes, there was a punt return touchdown and a drive set up on the 7, but the defense played pretty solid, especially on the ground. Take out, again, that 39-yard rush. They were only allowing 4 yards per carry, but that one right there was a big reason why that was bumped up a little bit. I will say defensively, though, outside of the one interception that Willa Howard had, he was looking very sharp. He was finding his guys. He was, 22 for 26, a little over 200 yards. Yes, the receiving talent was very good, but guys were also open, and they were hitting those corner routes a lot. So I would say secondary may be something to look at. They weren't getting a ton of pressure on Howard either. He was able to kind of maneuver the pocket with relative ease, and I think that was something that maybe was a little surprising. I personally thought that Michael Kamara and like James Carpenter, those guys, would be able to have more of a disruptive presence in the passing game. They were strong against the run, but the passing game, Ohio State was able to kind of pick apart, and that's where the weaker side looked from the IU defense. But overall, I just think they got outworked. It was one of those, that's a very good Ohio State team. I think they proved that, they have one loss, but it's a 1-point loss at Oregon. Yeah, I think, Big Ten championship. I think Ohio State's going to take down Oregon if we're making crazy predictions. But
well, let's hear from Curt Cignetti on his thoughts from the Oregon game and what happened there.
Our problem Saturday were assignment errors, right? Like day one protection, certain lineman's supposed to go to the left and he doesn't. All routine stuff. We didn't do a good job of handling it really well. Obviously, the punt team cost us 14 points. It's a 7-7 game with about 1:40 to go in the second quarter. We drop the snap, and they get the ball on the 7-yard line. And then we punt the ball first series of the second half and get a 79-yard punt return for a touchdown. Punt's supposed to be kicked to the right and ends up over on the left number, and all of our coverage is going right. Ball goes left, and we were in a bad spot. So we got to get back in sync offensively. And get our rhythm back, where we're playing with a lot of confidence.
Yeah, getting rhythm back is important, and this is one of the things that Indiana's got to demonstrate in this game coming up against Purdue is rhythm. If you look at what Indiana's done, and yes, they've played Ohio State, who's clearly, and I said Oregon going into the break, I meant Ohio State, obviously, but they played they played some of the best talent in the country. With Oregon, with I said it again, with Ohio State, and then of course a very talented defense in Michigan. Over the last 6 quarters, Indiana's only scored 18 points, and that's got to change. And a lot of it has looked like rhythm. The passing game, especially, has been way out of rhythm. The running game has not been able to get involved in a way that is meaningful for Indiana in those 6 quarters, essentially, except for that first drive. I would argue in the Ohio State game. So, Curt Cignetti, I remember hearing him talk a little bit earlier in the year about how he deals with his team. And, one of the things that is important in this process is how you deal with your team after a loss like this. It's really about rebuilding confidence, reminding guys of what they did well, and trying to figure out, how do you put them in a position where they can do it well moving forward. And that's going to be very important for Indiana. The season's not over. They're still in very good shape, we think. We'll find out for sure here in 10, 15 minutes or so as far as the college football playoffs concerned. But they're going to have a resounding performance against Purdue. And, going in and yelling at your players or talking about how that was a terrible performance isn't going to help get Indiana to the point where they can mentally and emotionally go in and play a good game against Purdue.
Yeah, and I think I think what Cignetti did, especially on Saturday, was take a lot of accountability in like crediting Ohio State and just like they outworked them and had the talent, outplayed them really throughout the game outside of that first drive, really. But something that I also really appreciated is how he harped on those high moments, like that first drive, like the last drive, and said those are things that you can look at and build from, because that last drive almost seemed like pure strategy to take as much time off the clock, get that touchdown to keep it within 2 scores, and keep yourself from this loss looking like a 3-score loss. Obviously, Travion Henderson had a different thing to say on his first carry of the next possession after the onside kick. But overall, it's just I don't think this team lacks confidence after a loss, because I think they've all been through so much. Some of these guys from JMU, they were that undefeated team, had a loss, still won games afterwards. And then the guys at IU, they have also not seen success like this. So they're confident in their ability. They know what they've been able to do for the previous 10 weeks or 9.5, if you don't want to totally include that second half versus Michigan. But like you said, I think some of these structural things offensively definitely need to be adjusted. And I mean, not to be too down on a team, but there is a team to kind of get right, get your offense back in sync. Purdue, a 1-10 team, is not the worst opportunity to kind of get some things back in rhythm. See, get the passing game back in sync. Elijah Surratt, I mean, he's had some drops in these past couple weeks, which, after the midway point of the year was calling himself Mr. Waffle House, always open. I mean, I'm not going to lie. He's open a lot of the time. It just, some of the times it doesn't break down, but
yeah, well, and it was less of an issue. It was a little bit of an issue in the Ohio State game, but Indiana just had trouble getting the ball to people in general. But as you mentioned, you're playing Purdue, and you could be of two minds on this. I mean, on the one hand, Purdue would love to ruin Indiana's season. Indiana has had some tough times here, and they need to figure out a way to execute. And it's one of those things where you always worry that a team might get overconfident, because Purdue has been bad, historically bad. This is one of the worst, if not the worst, Purdue team since World War II in terms of statistics. But it's, you also then sometimes worry about underrating your opponent. And we've seen Purdue they're not absent a pulse entirely. They almost beat Illinois at Illinois. They've played a couple of other teams relatively close. They were in that game at East Lansing over the weekend, taking on Michigan State, couldn't get the job done. But on the flip side, I think it's important to remember it's going to be cold. And we're going to talk about the weather in a minute. And Purdue has had a season from hell. They're 1-10. They're probably not going to be that motivated to go stand out in sub-freezing temperatures for 3 hours and compete hard against an Indiana team that has to know they got to go in and play at their apex to impress the committee and put themselves even more solidly into the college football playoff. We've got some sound from Curt Cignetti as he evaluates Purdue. Let's hear what he had to say about them.
Quarterback's a very talented guy. He's got arm talent and really good escapability. Tight end is a weapon with 46 catches. And one receiver, 7, is a very explosive player. And they got a speed guy, too, and then they got some guys that make good contested catches. I've always thought the running back was good. They're a capable team, and they're not having the kind of season they wanted to have, obviously. But they're also a team that scored 40 points in the second half against Illinois to come back from a 27-3 deficit and send the game to overtime. So at this level, everybody's capable.
And you'd expect him to say that, and he's right. I mean, and it's and we saw this week, Alabama with their college football playoff destiny on the line, losing to an Oklahoma team that's had a terrible season so far. Ole Miss, college football playoff life on the line. They go in, they lose at Florida. Florida, of course, has played better lately, but still, you would expect Ole Miss to be able to go in and win that one. We've watched BYU disintegrate with some games over the course of the last couple of weeks. We saw Colorado lose to a team with a losing record. I mean, there's a lot of things. Now, none of those teams are as bad as Purdue is bad. But I think it's going to be interesting to watch how Indiana handles this. And Joe, I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of like what Indiana needs to do, but it's just going to be interesting watching them deal with these conditions because, as I mentioned, it's going to be cold. You're probably not going to have the same crowd that you've gotten used to just by the fact that it's really cold, and you're not going to have all of the students back. So it could be kind of an odd atmosphere, and you just hope Indiana can figure out a way to play at a level that overcomes that and doesn't let it affect them.
I actually think the crowd will be solid. I'm not sure if it will totally be sellout, but because of everything that's on the line with it, and once again, like we've talked about really the entirety of every episode we've had, this is an unprecedented year for Indiana football. People are buying in, people are investing, and they want to see what this team can do, and especially the fact that this could be the last time a lot of everyone sees a team like this, and also a lot of these players, because some of these guys are so old, and like that makes so much of this team. But as far as like, I think they know what to play for, and I got to sit down with Mike Kadick a few weeks ago, and I asked him about Purdue because in his time at IU as a starter, he has never beat Purdue. Yeah. When he redshirted in back in 2019 was the lone time that IU has beat Purdue, and the last time that IU has beat Purdue. And he was like clenching, he was breaking his knuckles, like clenching his jaw when talking about Purdue. And he even said, like, there aren't words to describe how I feel about them. So it's something like that. One of the leaders, one of the three captains of this team, one of the veterans of this team, that trickles down. And someone asked Signetti about, like, obviously Purdue is a rivalry game, but a lot of these guys aren't used to that. And he gave a very blunt answer. He's like, these guys know what a rivalry game is, and they know what this game means, what is at stake. I think they have all of the motivation to go out and play like they did in the first 9.5 weeks of the season. And it just, that's really where it comes down to, is motivation. They have the talent, they have the capability. And like you said, with the weather, this game's going to rely a lot on the ground. And the ground game for IU has been tremendous this season. The line has been so good as far as creating holes, getting to that second level, and then the two running backs have been great. So I think they're going to put up some damage. This could be a 200-yard game on the ground combined from Ellis and Lawton, and seeing who else is in the mix.
Let's talk about the weather conditions that we're looking at in this game. It is one of those things where you see a forecast early sometimes and you think to yourself, well, maybe it won't actually be that way. And it's actually, I'm not gonna say it's gotten worse, but it certainly hasn't gotten any warmer. So as we call things up, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here because I think it's worth checking this out. If you look at the AccuWeather forecast, so during the day, it's 31 with 8-mile-an-hour winds gusting to 14. You got a 12% chance of snow and a wind chill of 26 going on throughout the course of the day. But then you get to the evening, and it drops to 20, west wind at 8, wind gusts to 12, still a chance of some precipitation, and a real feel, that's the wind chill, folks, of 14 degrees. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how the crowd reacts to this. As much as there's been a renaissance, or maybe not a renaissance involves that at one point, or implies at one point there were football fans that were really excited about being football fans, like all the new football fans for IU. This is the acid test. You're going to go out and stand in 17-degree weather and watch this team play. It's I hope so, because this team absolutely deserves the support. But I do worry a little bit. Like, if you go to StubHub, tickets for this game were going at around $200 last week. The get-in price as of 30 minutes ago is $50, including fees, to get into the game. So it seems like a lot of people are potentially bailing. And I am just kind of curious to see what we end up with in Memorial Stadium on Saturday night. It's a shame, too, because first ever night bucket game that was confirmed by Sports Information. That's a real cool scene. The bucket game under the lights. It's on national TV, albeit FS1. It'd be great to have a big crowd there. I'm just curious to see if people will actually venture out for it.
I think it's tough because with students especially, like, you never know who's going to be back. Because, I mean, especially for people that are out of state, you don't know what kind of plans they have to make, what kind of accommodations they have to make, whether they have their own car, whether they have to fly. I'm lucky that I live in Indiana and have my own car, so I'll be there. But I'm not a student that's going to be in the student section. I'm going to be on the field. So that's completely irrelevant to the point you're making.
Credentials, everybody. He'd like you to know that. Okay.
But I'm not sure. I haven't really asked around about how many people are planning on coming back. I was going to ask you, are you surprised that this game's at 7? Obviously, it's cool for the history in the scene. It's, the final game. But of all the games that IU could have gotten this late slate, like, 3 days ago,
right?
Why is
this one?
Why is this one the one that's under the lights?
It's because Indiana's 10-1 and is still technically alive for a Big Ten championship game berth. That's why.
That is fair.
So,
Penn State and Ohio State do crazy things.
Yeah, Penn State and Ohio State both lose and Indiana wins, then Indiana's going to the Big Ten title game. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but look, the networks generally, they'll go through and they will pick games based upon what's going to make the most sense for them in terms of potential ratings and in terms of which games matter the most. And, the first draft pick for this week is always Michigan, Ohio State. That's on Fox at big noon. And, you've got CBS that decided it was going to take Notre Dame USC. So that's a 3:30 game. You've got, the other night game that's being played in this one is Washington and Oregon. That's a big game. Yep. It's going to draw a big crowd. But the rest of them, it's like, look at the games that are out there.
Penn State, Maryland won't really draw anything massive.
Right. And it's
and then with, like you said, with everything on the line,
it is a weird. It's also kind of a weird week because you also have games on Friday. So, you've got Minnesota, Wisconsin playing at noon on CBS on Friday. That could have been a 7 p.m. Saturday kick if that had not been the day before. And you've also got Nebraska, Iowa, which would be another relatively big game, couple of really big fan bases there. That's at 7:30 on Friday. So I think, the way that the slots worked out, it made sense that I think if Indiana had beaten Ohio State, I think Indiana's probably the 3:30 game.
Yeah.
But because that didn't happen, obviously you move it to 7:00. So that's why it is interesting. But ultimately, Indiana, 9 million people watched that Ohio State game, which is pretty wild to think about. And Indiana's a recognizable thing. They're likely to be in the college football playoff, and that is going to draw some audience. And I think that's a good thing for Indiana.
Absolutely. And I think that right now, like you said, they've earned this kind of respect to generate this audience, generate the fans being there. But, 20 degrees, the wind chill, it's going to be tough to have them in the stadium. And I don't want to make any predictions because I could say that it's going to be underwhelming. Then all of a sudden it's 53,000 strong that are just drunk and cold. But hey, who do I know?
Well, we'll see. Look, it'd be great if I do hope students come back. I think it would be great to have the students back in the building for this one. And I just hope alums can, find a way to get in there and make some noise. It's a team that deserves that level of support. It is going to be some tough conditions, but look, it's one of the, we've had games like this before. Generally speaking, people haven't shown up. I'm hoping that it'll be different this time, but it's tough in any environment. When we see those big night crowds at Penn State or at Michigan State, generally not at Michigan or Ohio State because they refuse to play night games, it's not 17 degrees. It's like 40 degrees. There's a big difference between those two temperatures. I'll be out there, and I'm looking forward to it, but I'm also really trying to game plan how I'm going to handle the climate. And I think you should be doing the same. I don't want frostbite amongst IU sports media figures on the sidelines. So I'm going to put
true. I got some big cabin socks, big gloves, a big coat.
Get a
Big Ten.
Get a ski mask.
I do have a ski mask. Should I go full balaclava?
I think you should. At this point, you don't want to have your skin exposed like that for long periods of time. So it's just
true. That might be the best idea.
Yeah, but you're in charge of everybody else among IU sports media on the sideline. You have to go make sure that they're all dressing properly.
That's some high stakes right there. Well, I'm shooting my own video. Come on now, we're multitask down there.
That's right.
Yeah. Students taking stabs at students is some crazy work right there.
Especially when they live with you.
Especially one that's your roommate.
We are standing by as we're supposed to be doing the college football playoff live ranking.
Are you shocked that the game's still going on?
No, I'm not shocked that the game's still going on. Memphis and Michigan State are playing right now. And of course, we have this situation where ESPN decides that college basketball games are going to last 2 hours, which they never last 2 hours, especially when the previous game didn't end in a timely manner. So we're just waiting for Memphis to, I think, finally finish off Michigan State. There'll probably be 9,000 fouls in this thing. I did want to go ahead while we're waiting and talk through perhaps what I think the College Football Playoff Committee is going to do. Okay. And, we might as well talk a little bit about this and talk through some of the scenarios, because ultimately what's going to be fascinating about all of this is how does the committee decide they're going to go about handling all of the chaos that happened this past week. There was a ton of it, Joe. We talked about a lot of it at the start of the show. Indiana, to some degree, kind of got lucky in that they lost early, and they lost to a team that was ranked second in the country on their home field.
Yep.
And you look at a lot of their competition. We mentioned some of them at the start of the show: Alabama, Ole Miss, BYU, Colorado, Army they were kind of on a fringe, but these were all teams, with the exception of Army, that lost to inferior competition. And I think to some degree, as much as people perhaps at the end of the Ohio State game might have been tempted to say, oh, that disqualifies Indiana from the college football playoff, everything that happened after that basically said, well, no, actually not, because now Indiana's strength of schedule is basically twice as good as it was before. It jumped from like 104th to 52nd. And the teams that they're in competition with for bids all lost, or most of them lost at least. And so that was probably, in a bad situation for Indiana, the best possible outcome.
Yeah, and I will say, kind of like with the inaugural rankings of this season, something that Reese Davis said is how the rankings are going to be pretty similar to the AP poll rankings. And if you go to what the AP poll is currently, it's pretty, I think it's going to allow IU to be in. Obviously, they're going to drop because of the loss, but I imagine the AP poll and the college football playoff will be relatively consistent, because that's what it's been for the past couple weeks. And they've done a solid job. They've kind of stuck to that. They have obviously, like we've talked about, honored teams that win and punish teams that lose. They're going to punish Indiana, but they're also going to punish these now 3-loss SEC teams. I'm not sure how much, but they will get punished.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, and I'm gonna call up my rankings here. I'm trying to do something special with the ticker, and we'll see if I can get the ticker to work. All right. Oh, maybe I can just do all this as a banner. Okay, so that's not terribly readable. Maybe we can scroll that instead. Nope, it's not going to scroll. So, if you can. You know what? Let me edit that a little bit just so it's a little bit easier to read. Keep talking, Joe, while I do some on the fly graphic stuff here.
Well, I will say it looks like, from what your prediction is, from what's been chattered around the national media, that with a win against Purdue, IU should be pretty much locked in. The only thing is what the championship games are going to entail, just with all the chaos that can still ensue. Like with Texas A&M, Texas playing this week in the Lone Star Showdown, I think that winner goes to the SEC championship. And like, what if Texas A&M makes the SEC championship against Georgia, and then now Georgia's a 3-loss team? Does a 3-loss SEC you're in the championship game? What's the wager right there? So I don't know. It just
so let's
there's
talk
so much. There's so much still at stake. So
here we go.
Hard.
So here's what I was trying to do. So if you look at this, basically, this is my projections. So the way to interpret this, the first number is the number that I think the teams will be in the ranking. The second number is the seed, keeping in mind the auto bids. So I anticipate the committee is going to have Oregon first. Still, there's no reason why they would drop them. Ohio State second, Texas third, Penn State fourth, Notre Dame fifth, Miami sixth, which I don't think Miami should be ahead of Indiana. I'm just going to say that right now. There's no argument for Miami to be ahead of Indiana, but I just have a sneaking suspicion they'll end up there. Georgia seventh, Indiana eighth, Tennessee ninth, Boise State 10th, SMU 11th, Clemson 12th, but out of the playoff. Bama 13th, SC 14th, Arizona State 15th with the last auto bid. And so what that would set up would essentially be Oregon is the 1 seed, Texas is the 2 seed, Miami is the 3 seed, Boise State is the 4, Ohio State is the 5, Penn State is the 6, Notre Dame is the 7, Georgia is the 8, Indiana is the 9, Tennessee is the 10, SMU is the 11, and then Arizona State as the 12. So in this scenario,
IU in Athens.
This would be IU going to Athens, which is now. Here's the thing I'll say.
Talk atmosphere there.
I hesitate with getting too much into any of the projected rankings because if
I like talking hypothetical though.
If Georgia does what you expect, which is wins against Georgia Tech,
right,
and then beats either Texas or Texas A&M in the SEC championship game, Georgia would be the 2 seed at that point. And so you would not, if you were Indiana, be going there. You might instead be going to Athens or Texas, having lost in the SEC championship game and still not.
That would probably be switching them right there.
Right. So there's a lot of things, and this is where it's important to keep in mind. Like right now, Oregon's 1 and Ohio State is 5 in terms of seeding. But as you said earlier, I would expect Ohio State to beat Oregon on a neutral field. It's a neutral field, but there's going to be a ton of Ohio State fans in Lucas Oil Stadium. And so I would expect Ohio State to win that game, which would make them the 1 seed and would drop Oregon to 5.
Probably.
Yeah. Penn State is probably locked in. Penn State's probably not going to jump Oregon, I'm guessing, at this point. Notre Dame, this is a situation where how does Notre Dame fare against USC? USC finally looks like they have a bit of a pulse. They go and come from behind and they beat UCLA. They don't look like they're in the same ballpark as Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's got to go to the Coliseum and play USC in LA, so anything's possible. Miami, right now, they're the 3 seed, but they got to beat Syracuse this weekend, and then they're going to have to play SMU, most likely, in the ACC championship game. Well, if SMU wins that game, SMU's the 3 seed, not Miami. And so this is where I would be cautious about getting too far mentally or emotionally down the pathway of any of the current projections that you'll see tonight or anything that you're seeing here, because ultimately there's so much that will change here, not just this weekend, but also conference championship weekend, that will materially affect the seeding and where everybody's at. And keep in mind, like across the board here, like Georgia's got to play Georgia Tech. They'll probably win that, but it's not inconceivable given how inconsistent Georgia's played and given the fact that Georgia Tech's already knocked off Miami that they could spring an upset there.
Galen, did you just watch like The Princess Bride? You've used the inconceivable a few times.
Inconceivable.
I'm a big fan of the word.
I've never seen that movie. I've seen clips from that movie.
All right, well, you have homework to do once the chat's done.
Those of you in the YouTube chat can't see this, but the look on Emily Fox's face when I said I hadn't seen Princess Bride gave me all kinds of life that I didn't know that I had. That's tremendous. It's one of those weird quirks. I've seen clips from the movie, certainly. I've never actually watched the thing all the way through. Not particularly upset about that either, okay? I remember
movie. Come on now.
Yeah, I dated a girl in college who had the exact same perspective I did, which was like she had seen it and she's like, it was really not very good. It was terribly overrated. And so I was like, that's fine. I'm not going to watch it. And I've stuck with that for 25 years. Looking at some of the other items, Josh Bowles apparently has not seen Princess Bride either. Thank you, Josh. I'm glad I'm not the only one. But a couple of other ones. Tennessee still has to go to Vanderbilt.
Yep.
And I wouldn't.
Vanderbilt spoiled some seasons.
And Vanderbilt, that is going to be their Super Bowl. If they could imagine beating Tennessee,
knock them out
of the college football playoff. Boise State is probably in good shape as long as they can beat UNLV.
Yep.
The big interesting questions here are with some of these other matchups. So Nick Barna asked, do we want Texas or A&M to win Saturday? There's actually 2 schools of thought, I would argue here.
I would say Texas.
So School of Thought A says Texas, that you just want to knock A&M completely out of the picture, and that I would argue A&M's already knocked out of the picture. So, so the idea is, well, do you want Texas to win? So then they're in a position where they're going to be taking on Georgia in the SEC championship game. I would argue that it'd be interesting if Texas lost that game.
I think Texas still is in the playoffs though.
Well, but maybe not. Okay, they may be in the playoff.
That's a big punish.
Hold on. They may be in the playoff, but they might be behind Indiana. Because if you think about it, that Texas team at that point, if they lose that game, is 10-2. They would have one more loss than Indiana, and their best win would be a 3-point win on the road against Vanderbilt. Unless I guess you could theoretically say, oh, the Oklahoma win is their best win now. I'm not sure if that would actually qualify, given that Oklahoma hasn't had a very good season. They were ranked at the time that they played them. Yeah. I think it would. There's an argument to be made if Indiana blows out Purdue and Texas loses to A&M, and then A&M goes in and loses to Georgia. A&M will be done anyway, but it might knock an SEC team like Texas down in the pecking order somewhat compared to where Indiana's at. The safest bet is probably what you just said, but part of this here, Joe, if you're an Indiana fan, is you want to host. You want to have an SEC team have to come here on the 20th or 21st and
make
play
life hard.
Yeah, and I think a Texas loss here and then an A&M loss to Georgia, which would be very likely in the SEC championship game, is a more sure route to Indiana being a team that could host, because they might potentially move ahead of Texas in the pecking order. But you do run the risk, if that is the scenario, of A&M pulling the shocker and knocking off Georgia, and that could lead to an extra SEC team in the playoffs. So there's a lot of game theory here.
The big one that I'm kind of looking at this weekend is the Clemson-South Carolina game, because either of those teams winning, that is a big win, especially if they're up there, 12-14 in that range. That's a big win. Clemson, with some help, could be playing in the ACC championship game. And if Clemson beats South Carolina, it's going to be hard. Pending that one of these other teams doesn't lose, it's going to be kind of hard to leave them out. So I don't think they'll bunny hop Indiana. I think that's hard to do right there. But
I don't know.
They're fringe. They're fringe to get in.
Here's the thing: a lot of the propaganda around South Carolina is just unintelligible BS being spewed by all of these SEC burner accounts and by their cronies in the media. I don't fundamentally understand the love for South Carolina given what they've done so far this year. We talked about this on the Crimson Cast recap show on Sunday, but if you look at who they've beaten, they've got home wins against Texas A&M, and then they've got a 4-point win at home versus Missouri. If they beat Clemson, that's great. They'd still have 3 losses, and that would be their best win. I have a hard time seeing a team whose best wins are Texas A&M, Missouri, and Clemson, justifying getting in with 3 losses when your losses on the season were to LSU, Mississippi, and Alabama, and the Mississippi loss was not particularly close. Clemson probably has a worse case. Clemson, what is their best win, Joe? I would invite you to go look at their schedule and tell me what their best win is. Is it Pitt? It was South Carolina. If they beat South Carolina, that would become their best win. But it would be like Pitt or wow. Right.
Okay. Touche.
Yeah. But it's interesting. It's like people are like, well, they beat South Carolina, they should be considered in. And it's like they would have a win over a 4-loss South Carolina team at that point. Like how is that a qualifying victory? So these are the things that keep me up at night that I think about. I don't know exactly what the committee decides to do in that circumstance.
How much fun do you think the committee has having to, debate debacle through all of this?
I don't know. They may have some fun. They probably, who knows? It's hard to say how the committee evaluates this stuff. I will say, I think the committee's greatest joy is probably hearing people complain about the things that they did after the fact.
Absolutely. But the thing is would the modern Joe Schmo have any clue of who to put 12 teams in? I just don't think so.
No.
I don't know if there's a perfect way to do it. Someone's going to be mad at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's not a perfect way to do it. A lot of it really comes down. There's a subjective element, and as much as committees generally stink, in any walk of life, the reason you do it is that so you can try to arrive at some degree of consensus.
Right.
With Indiana, the big thing, and this was brought up by Tanis in the chat, if the committee decides they're going to punish Indiana too much for losing at the number 2 team in the country, I've got some questions.
That's true.
I
don't blame you for that.
And again, it's like, what is the distinguishing figure with Penn State's schedule that makes them better than Indiana? Penn State already lost at home to Ohio State. They didn't, they're what, 5th or whatever it is in the college football playoff rankings. And so I think there's got to be some kind of an accounting about how the committee is looking at some of these teams. Miami is another one where Miami lost. They dropped some, but they didn't drop a tremendous amount. BYU did drop quite a bit, but again, BYU wasn't that good of a team. The statistics said they weren't that good of a team. They got a lot of wins in the closing minutes. They kind of skated by. They were not very highly rated in S&P Plus, and then they turned around and lost again. So I think that was more them finding their level than it was the committee punishing them. But so it's going to be a really interesting question mark as we get to the, my hope is that we don't see a situation where the committee does what the pollsters did, which was be overreactionary and decide that they're going to rank both Miami and SMU above Indiana, despite their resumes not justifying it, and move Tennessee up ahead of Indiana, despite Tennessee beating UTEP over the weekend. Yeah. I still have questions. This is where the polls just don't make a lot of sense. So you lose at the number 2 team in the country. Another team beats a team that doesn't have a pulse, and you're going to move them over that team. It just doesn't really compute as far as I'm concerned.
The big thing, they just what I've noticed, the committee just doesn't like seeing losses, and when it happens, it's just like this glaring alarm. And I think the fact that Penn State lost to Ohio State, was it right before the first rankings or like a week before or something like that? So by the time the rankings come out, it's like, oh, their loss was to Ohio State. But now that the rankings are happening consistently, it's like they see this loss and it's like, oh my gosh, it doesn't matter who almost. And the whole strength of schedule too, like now that IU has a stronger strength of schedule than Miami and SMU and also Oregon.
Yeah, I mean,
so you have to toss that argument out the window now, because if you still use it, you got to now use it for SMU and Miami, which that hasn't been the case.
Yeah, exactly. So let's we're just go. The ESPN, their graphics department demanded that they get to show all of the pretty things that they design. So we're right now on the show. They're going through that process. They're explaining the buys and whatnot, and we've got the playoff rankings from last week up, obviously, that we're going to be keeping an eye on. So last week, 25 through 20 was Illinois, UNLV, Mizzou, Iowa State, Arizona State, and Tulane. And we'll see what it looks like this time around as they're still running through graphics. It's like, guys, maybe dump out of the package as opposed to, just hitting the button like everything's normal. They're still showing graphics here. I'm getting annoyed by this, Joe, frankly.
Yeah.
We're still showing graphics. It's going to be interesting, I think, next week more than anything else. That's the ranking that really ends up being the one that sets everything going into that championship weekend. And as we think about where Indiana's at, this is why this Purdue game coming up this week is really, really important in terms of style points. Okay, so we've got
Colorado
25th. They dropped from 16th to 25th. And that's not surprising. I'm a little surprised they're still in the top 25. We get Kansas State back in. So that's, I guess, not too surprising as well. They're kind of hovering around an 8-3.
There's a Big Ten team.
Yeah, Illinois at 23rd. Illinois, of course, needed a last-second pass to beat Rutgers over the weekend. I was almost right in that. It's like, why is Illinois going to lose that game? They almost did. UNLV, a little bit of a surprise here. They were 24th last week. They are now 22nd. They move up a couple of spots.
That also, with Boise State playing them, that now can solidify Boise State getting that top 4, getting that bye if they win against UNLV, pretty much.
And then the committee's ill-fated romance with Missouri continues unabated, up to 21st in the poll, despite no clear sense as to why. Texas A&M drops from 15th to 20th. So they dropped 5 whole spots based upon that loss that they suffered this past weekend. Obviously, some conversation being had around this Texas A&M choice.
That's the crazy thing. If Texas A&M beats Texas and then somehow manages to beat Georgia in the SEC championship game, then now it's chaos.
Yeah,
now that's a 3-loss Georgia team. Texas A&M with the auto bid.
Well, and
what is happening there?
And A&M at that point is probably 13th or 14th. That could be a situation where the SEC champ doesn't get a bye.
Yeah.
Let's put that a pin in that for a second.
We'll wait to see what happens.
Iowa State up 4 spots to 18th. Tulane up 3 spots, so they go from 20th to 17th. Tulane hovering around. I mean, they're going to get a chance to play Army in the AAC champ.
If Boise State loses, that's your next up for Group of 5.
And then there's Arizona State.
What a story! Them and Indiana both picked at bottom of the barrel. And
so,
just the turnaround, it's been remarkable.
We're starting to see teams that I had thought we would see. I thought they would have Arizona State 15th. So Arizona State, who's going to be the top-rated Big 12 team, 16th in the rankings. South Carolina, 15th.
Pretty close.
Which means this is interesting. So now I'm wondering what they did with the order from this point forward. So I had South Carolina projected to be 14th. They end up being 15th. They jump up 3 spots here. More conversation being had here.
Taking their time.
There it is. So Ole Miss is, I don't know. That's interesting. Ole Miss at 14th. That's actually bad news for South Carolina, I would argue.
Yeah, that's
the fact that Ole Miss loses that game and still stays ahead of South Carolina. I think, Joe, the committee agrees with me that South Carolina's resume is kind of trashy.
That's fair. It's not great. I hadn't noticed it until you brought it up. So
that's what I'm here for.
I'll bite the bullet on that one.
Now, what do they do?
There it is.
Alabama drops 6 spots. I mean, again, it's like no question Alabama's got.
Why are we showing Alabama highlights?
Because we have to. I think the ESPN is contractually obligated to show Alabama highlights. Like if someone were to sneeze on ESPN's air and the sound came out and it sounded even vaguely like Alabama.
Like Roll Tide or something?
Or Roll Tide, you'd have to show highlights of Alabama.
They scored what? 3 points against Oklahoma, and they're showing Alabama-Georgia highlights.
Yes.
So I guess make it make sense is what I'm getting at. I get the whole contract and whatever. But
yeah, so I'm guessing Clemson is going to be at 12.
Clemson at 12.
Let's see if that's actually.
Is that what you predicted?
I had Clemson at 12, and there they are.
There they are. Yep.
So this is interesting. And again, I think that Clemson is overrated there, but the fact that they rank Clemson there doesn't surprise me too much. Largely, I think because Clemson has 2 losses. It does put Clemson in a position where they will benefit if they beat South Carolina. It actually puts South Carolina in a position where they'll benefit more if they beat Clemson.
Yeah.
So this is something I think to keep in mind and keep an eye on. And now I think the big question is what is this 11th team?
I will say with the Clemson, South Carolina, it's going to be hard. They're going to need some help.
Yeah,
from the outside to try and get these other teams in.
So now we wait to see who pops up at 11th. And this is, I think if Indiana doesn't pop up here, you can start to feel good. I think and it's Boise State at 11. So Indiana should feel good. That means that Indiana is
now they're in
above Boise State. And yes, as Joe has pointed out, they are in. And this is where the seeding thing becomes really interesting because the seeding aspect comes down to, what are your top 4 conference champions? So Boise State there is the 4th team, and
they are a fun team to watch.
They are
Ashton Genty is unreal.
Yeah, they are very fun. They obviously played Oregon very well earlier on in the season.
Oh, someone might be a little bit ahead of us. In the comments, I
think I'm not sure that. No, I think they're not ahead.
There it is.
Wow, Indiana does drop all the way to 10th. Well, that's
similar. Like I said, the AP poll, it's been pretty mirrored the entire time.
Well, that's not ideal for Indiana, and I would actually argue that's a pretty big penalty for Indiana.
Absolutely,
especially with SMU ahead of them. So that's again, I on the one hand, it's helpful because either SMU or Miami is guaranteed to lose at least one more game, and that will probably drop drop them under Indiana, whichever of those teams. But this is where you do have to be a little bit concerned now if you're Indiana, because if Clemson beats South Carolina, is the committee setting it up where they would move Clemson ahead of Indiana in the pecking order?
But then, again, they're just back to the whole resume and stuff. I guess that's the ranked win. So now Tennessee
at 8th, and
a big win against UTEP.
Yep. And Tennessee in the last poll, so Tennessee goes up 3 spots. Again, I don't really understand the metrics being used at this point by the committee when it comes to who they're ranking and why. Because I'm not. If it's strength of schedule, Indiana should be ahead of SMU. If it's losses, Indiana should be ahead of Tennessee. There's Georgia, and so we can kind of more or less guess what the rest of the rankings are going to be here. With Miami in 6th. And then Notre
Dame, Penn State, Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon. So we'll wait for the remaining list here. I guess it's just back. That'll be interesting. So is this setting up for Indiana to be the 11?
I think Indiana would be the 11 in this setup. Yeah, because there's Miami.
Oh, that's right.
So Miami would be the 3, and then as we game this out,
so Boise State at the 4, Miami at the 3,
Texas at the 2,
Oregon at the 1, Ohio State at the 5, Penn State at the 6.
Yep.
So that would be an Indiana Penn State, if what we're thinking is correct.
I think that's correct.
That's now.
No, it wouldn't be.
Or no, is Indiana going to be 10?
Hold on a second. I'm doing the math real quick here.
I'm trying to just do it in my head here.
No. I got it here. So Indiana would be the 10, and I think they would play Georgia. Okay. And that is, So basically, I think what we've got now is Oregon is the 1, Texas is the 2. Miami is the 3, Boise State is the 4, Ohio State is the 5, Notre Dame is the 6, Georgia is the 7, Tennessee is the 8, SMU is the 9, Indiana is the 10, Clemson is the 11, and then Arizona State is the 12. Yeah, that's exactly how it's shaping up. Okay. So, well, obviously, you'd like to see Indiana move higher. The nice thing is, as long as Indiana handles business against Purdue, they will move probably at least 1 spot higher and maybe more than 1 spot higher.
I will say this about what's setting up right now is the Big Ten runner-up likely, unless if Ohio State gets bounced back a little further.
Right.
But if Oregon loses and is at the 5, their path is going to be the Big 12 championship. And then if they win that, they play Boise State. Just showing kind of what that path is for what the projected 5 seed would be in this instance.
Yeah. But in this one, Indiana is the last at large, so to speak. And so that's going to be an interesting one for Indiana to deal with. And someone pointed out I did miss Penn State in that process. So this would put Indiana against Penn State in what would be the 6-11 matchup. It's a nice matchup for Indiana. There are worse teams to play in this mess than Penn State, but you do worry a little bit about the way that this
rematch. Interesting.
Yeah,
they got a rematch right there with Tennessee, Georgia.
You worry a little bit about how this plays out for Indiana, though, because you've got Clemson lurking outside, who's going to get a chance at a potentially bigger victory than Indiana will.
Yep.
Or you have South Carolina potentially getting a victory over the team that's the first team out. Would that be enough to move them ahead of Indiana? It's hard to say.
That's again that 3-loss team.
Yeah, Exactly.
And it's like you can't have a 3-loss team in. Especially if they're 11-1, I feel like that's criminal to leave out, especially with everything that happened last season with Florida State.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly.
That just right there should be the end of the discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think again though, as I'll note,
because Penn State is 10-1, and right now is 6. So
as I'll note, I think the thing that Indiana's gonna hopefully benefit from is Miami and SMU are going to play each other. Miami is 3 spots ahead of SMU. If Miami beats SMU in the ACC championship game, or either way, really, you would think that Indiana would move ahead of whoever loses that game.
That's where it's going to be interesting. I don't know how much weight they're going to put on the loss of a championship game.
Well, but here's the thing. I think
that's the biggest thing.
They've got to weight it to some degree.
And there will be weight, but like as compared to a regular season loss.
No, I
agree. It's that 13th game rather than I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a possibility. The other thing, obviously, as we talked about, this is where you got to become big Vanderbilt fans this weekend. You want Tennessee to pick up another loss. There aren't a lot of other teams up in this mix that other than Texas, which, as we said, like if Texas loses, the fact that they're still third, I still don't fundamentally understand the thought process there, given who their whole resume has been against. I mean, look at who their best wins are. Them being third with that resume is a bit of a head scratcher.
I think at the time when they played Michigan, they were ranked too. So
now, I mean, that's the thing. It doesn't really.
Who cares at that point?
Right.
It's the same Michigan team that IU beat. It's an interesting.
Yeah.
Well, not even interesting. It's just I don't know. It's college football.
So look, a lot left to go, and then the other one, of course, and the one I think that everybody should be rooting for more than anything else is USC and Notre Dame. You want USC to win that game now. I think you've got a clear rationale for wanting Notre Dame to lose that game, and so that's something everybody should be thinking about as we move forward. But yeah, the big question mark is going to be that what happens with that South Carolina Clemson game now, and does that harm Indiana? Indiana's going to need to, I think, beat Purdue handily. They need to do what the committee liked about them before, which was their ability to win games by large margins. And that seemed to be, I think, the key to how the committee evaluated Indiana in the mix. And that's what went away the last couple of weeks.
I agree with that. I think they do need to show the team that was there the first 9 weeks, the team that was putting up 45 points per game and beating teams by 30.
Yeah.
That team needs to be the one that shows up. This can't be I understand it's cold and weather's going to be a factor, but this is a game where the offense needs to be. They were at the time one of the best scoring offenses in the country before these past 2 weeks. So this is the type of game you have to have a performance like that. Show the country, not just for your own self-confidence of a team, but you got to show the country that you belong in this moment. Yep, because they believe they belong, and rightfully so, especially if they're 11-1. But there's people that don't think they belong. That's where it all comes down to. Those people that don't think are the ones that are talking on this committee show right here.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, I think this is where you probably got to root for South Carolina. Because again, as you said, I have a hard time envisioning a scenario where they're going to put a 3-loss SEC team in over a 1-loss Big Ten team. I could see them trying to put another ACC team in the mix if it's Clemson. And Clemson is the bigger brand between those two, and clearly, that matters. Of course, these folks at ESPN, after harping on Indiana's strength of schedule forever, as we hear from our folks in the chat, are now downplaying the strength of schedule jump like it doesn't matter. So as I said before, the disingenuous arguments are going to be disingenuous regardless of what the scenario is. This is very much what you can expect from ESPN and the way that they have tried to shape the agenda on all of this stuff. It's pretty despicable, but it's part of what they do. So I don't know. The committee clearly has some questions within itself about what it's deciding to prefer within this process. And, Indiana's, again, they're going to have to go out and show no mercy and leave no doubt against Purdue, and then hope some they get some extra cushion. We'll see a lot more next week, obviously, because most teams will be done by next week in terms of their seasons. We'll just have the conference championship games afterwards. And so we'll get a better sense at that point of who's going to get in and what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where things are at. And I don't know. It's going to be a really fascinating next couple
fun.
of weeks. Yeah. So
I don't know if it'll be fun. It might be stressful for some, but
well, it's
the holiday season, isn't it?
That's right. That's what we need. More stress around the holidays, Joe. So anyway, it's again, we'll see what happens. We'll have more podcast coverage coming up later on this week. Obviously a little tough with the holidays. But we'll at least have a preview episode coming up for the Purdue game, and we'll have obviously our recap show on Sunday as Indiana comes out of that game, hopefully victorious by a wide margin and creating, or lessening the doubt, shall we say, as far as the committee's concerned. So we'll go ahead and get ready to wrap up here. Joe, any final thoughts from you?
Not really. I think, like a lot of the comments are saying, it's kind of just a win and in show. Like I said before, this is the one. Like, you just got to get back. And that's what it all comes down to. There's been so much buzz around this team this season, the highs and the very slim amount of lows there, and they have to ride the high that they had for the first 9 weeks. And
yeah,
it's very capable of doing it because, I mean, we've seen it in front of our own eyes.
Yep.
For the majority of this season. This team is talented. This team, I believe, is deserving of one of the 12 spots because they've played like one of the top 12 teams and they're deserving of it. And there's no reason they should be left out because of name brand. That's crazy to me.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, the big question mark is they jumped Clemson 5 spots from the last CFP rankings to this one, 12th. Or from 17th to 12th, and that was off of a win against Pittsburgh. So what happens, this week if Clemson ends up beating South Carolina? I feel like it's hard to make an argument for South Carolina over Indiana. It's probably easier in the committee's eyes to make an argument for a 10-2 team over an 11-1 team. But we'll have to see how things play out. So anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap up here. My thanks to all you folks for joining us here on Bison Chat. We'll be back, obviously, with another Bison Chat next Tuesday. We'll sync that up with the rankings reveal as well. We'll also have, as I mentioned, the rest of our programming on the Back Home Network and across all the IU sports media properties. So for Joe and for our producer, Emily Fox, I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us here tonight, folks. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.